Having flown in from London via Oslo, our expedition aboard a ship of the same name is starting at Longyearbyen. It has a population of 2,667, many fewer than the number of polar bears that roam the archipelago. Situated midway between Norway and the North Pole, the history of Longyearbyen is founded on its role as a whaling base and then subsequently on mining. Now tourism is the main source of income, and in 2018 156,000 people visited Svarlbad. It took quite some time to get 115 people on board and settled into their cabins, so we departed quite late in the day. But this was no impediment to our progress. There was no set itinerary as such, so every day in theory was free to take us where the ice would allow and where the wildlife could be found.
Good morning. If you live in cabins 206,
Once on board, the top priority is to get familiar with the routines, the evacuation procedures, and how to use the zodiacs. Coming from the UK, 24 hours of daylight seemed quite strange at first, but you soon get used to it and see it as a great photographic opportunity. By afternoon we'd reached a point almost 79.5 degrees north. We'd anchored in Magdalena Fjord to explore the remains of a whaling operation established in the early 1600s. Thousands of little auks inhabit the surrounding peaks, while black guillemots showed us the way to the beach and a herd of walruses, who were completely fascinated by the arrival of a lot of red-coated visitors. Pretty they aren't, but walruses certainly are characterful, a bit like our ship. It was only day 2 of the expedition, but already we were identifying with it as home. It was good to get ashore for the first time, but the melting snow and ice demanded care, as well as providing a lesson in just how harsh the conditions must have been for those early hunters, spending winter at below freezing temperatures and without any daylight for months on end. The fjord is 8 kilometres long by 5 kilometres wide, big enough to cater for the biggest boats that want to enter it now. History tells us it was first explored by William Barents in 1596. He was followed by an Englishman, Robert Fotherby, in 1614. So we really did feel as if we were walking in the steps of history, especially as there is now evidence that boats sailed here as early as the 12th century. Fortunately for us, the fjord is blessed with good beaches, which enable the use of the zodiacs, especially as the mountains provide shelter from the strong winds, so that it's possible to get good views of the glaciers. Overnight, the decision had been made that as we were already near the northern tip of the archipelago, we'd continue sailing in that direction to see how far the pack ice had reached and whether or not any polar bears might be found. This meant spending most of the day outside looking for the ice. The part of it entailed listening to a fascinating presentation from one of the expedition team on why the extent of sea ice matters for the planet. In a nutshell, the ice is critical in regulating the world's climate. Less ice equals more heat. At first the ship sliced through the ice quite easily, but soon the noise emanating from the hull gave evidence to the fact that the ice we could see was only a fraction of the depth of the sheet itself. Again and again we'd come to a full stop, only for the captain to shift the ship's position and slowly break through to clear water. Although it was difficult, we were still making good progress when we made our trip to the bridge, and a warm welcome from the captain. He explained that this year the ice is some 60 to 70 kilometres further south than in 2018. Last year the bears had had a very long swim to find the ice, the seals on which they feed. The skill of the captain is critical in finding the weak spot in the ice, then forcing the bow of the ship into it, literally breaking it open and pushing it aside. By afternoon it was clear that we were going to get no further. We'd reached almost 80 degrees north, still 600 miles from the North Pole, but a fascinating day nonetheless. Overnight the ship repositioned further south, in Fjord. It's a beautiful landscape, with plenty of landing places for the Zodiacs. The party split into two groups, one walking on the cliff edge and the other cruising the shore. The bird life consisted mainly of guillemots, fulmars and kittiwakes, and supplemented by reindeer grazing the grass on the cliff edge. After an hour or so it was our turn to get into the Zodiac, and for a while all went well, while we enjoyed the puffins, when suddenly over the radio came a warning that 2 polar bears had been seen. In fact, they were right above us on the cliff edge. We couldn't see them for a while, but when they did appear we had only a very limited time to take some distant shots, before the captain ordered a full evacuation of the beach. Exciting and frustrating in equal measure. By the time that everyone got back to the ship safely, the bears, who moved exceedingly quickly, were a distance away, showing themselves only in silhouette as they walked round this bit of land. This was our cue to re-embark the Zodiacs, so that we could go and observe the bears from the fjord. Whilst I would have loved a closer viewing of the bear and her cub, safety always comes first, but it certainly had been an object lesson in just how quickly the largest land predator can move. Overnight our ship relocated much further south, to Hornsund. This beautiful location was found by James Poole, an English explorer, who gave the fjord its name in 1610. After that, ownership was claimed variously between the Dutch and the Danish. But because of its topography, there are very few landing places. but cruising through on the Zodiacs is still extremely rewarding. In the truest sense of the word, approaching these magnificent glaciers was truly awe-inspiring, not least as one of them started carving just as we were approaching. As we moved along the glacier, there was plenty of evidence of other carvings. We were surrounded by the debris of similar recent events.
It's actually pushing us now. The pressure of this.
For the afternoon activity, we once again boarded the Zodiacs, this time to visit Gunnarlodden and its bird colonies, as well as the occasional beluga whale. Hornsund has a history of being used by trappers, especially for polar bears. The remains of one of the huts they used still exists. Its prime occupant was a Norwegian lady called Annie Woolsted, who lived here in the 1930s. After our morning exercise with the kittiwakes and guillemots, the afternoon was spent cruising the Brepollen Glacier. Although by now we'd seen several glaciers, they were all different from each other. In this case we were able to get very close to some of the icebergs displaying their beautiful colours, as well as observing birds nesting in an ice cave.
They're rising up. So if you can imagine this iceberg tilted up vertically.
Having done a lot of sitting on our expedition, this morning we were going to take a walk. Approximately 4 kilometres around the south side of Belsund. The first thing to greet us though were the many bones of belugas killed here years ago by trappers. Thankfully, numbers are now increasing, and although I failed to successfully video any, they were briefly seen in many different locations. This was, however, more than a gentle stroll, as the tundra was very wet and sponge-like, so picking the right path was essential. The walk did, however, give us one of our best wildlife sightings of the whole trip, as we came across an Arctic fox, busy eating a fish for its lunch. As we walked down to the beach, I even managed to get a fleeting glimpse of a beluga, but don't blink. Fortunately, the weather remained very good for our afternoon walk, with the temperature even reaching 10 degrees, rendering some of the several layers of clothes that we were wearing redundant. Waiting for us was a rocky monolith, home to hundreds, if not thousands, of little orcs, swirling in great numbers over our heads. These little birds were extremely difficult to photograph, let alone video, but they made a relentless noise, and together with the late sighting of a reindeer, it was certainly an experience not to be forgotten. The last day in our final fjord, which took its name from St. John the Evangelist. With a full complement of zodiacs, we set off through the freshly carved ice, finding several bearded seals, one of which bore the scars of a recent encounter, probably with a polar bear. With hardly any wind, the silky smooth water provided ideal conditions for the zodiacs, but they still couldn't avoid riding over some of the ice. Having spotted this bearded seal from some way off, it took us quite a while to gently manoeuvre the boat around him so as to get the sun on his face. What this clip illustrates, however, is the nature of wildlife in the Arctic is often a single animal. Birds, of course, are the exception. Photography can therefore be quite challenging, but rewarding in other areas such as landscapes, especially with 24 hours daylight. There are many more possibilities to be explored. One of the many things that we learned on this trip is that the ice sings. Well, actually it sounds more like a crackle. But for a time the outboard motor was turned off and we simply just listened. Our last planned activity took us back further north to be near Fjord and disembarkation the following morning. Pool Pitjen is a sandy spit of land, named after Pool, who was a whaler, but is now a well-used haul-out for walruses. To ensure everyone had an equal opportunity, each Zodiac group had a 30-minute session with the all-male herd. These animals used to be killed in their thousands for their oil, but now fortunately numbers are recovering well. After 15 years of travelling to Africa for its wildlife, going to the Arctic represented a big change, but its climate, the wildlife and the landscapes were an enlightening experience, one that we would love to repeat should the opportunity present itself.